You watched people around you move forward, while your own life seemed to remain still. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations became shorter. Even in rooms full of people, you felt strangely alone, as though everyone else had received a map for life that somehow never reached your hands. You smiled when someone asked how you were doing, because explaining the truth felt impossible. How could you describe the quiet ache of feeling different without sounding ungrateful? How could you explain that you loved God, yet still wrestled with questions that surfaced only in silence? There were nights when you replayed every decision you had made, wondering if you had somehow ruined your future or misunderstood your purpose. You prayed, waited, hoped, and then waited some more. Sometimes it seemed as though heaven was silent, while everyone else's prayers were being answered. Those moments can leave a person questioning not only their direction, but also their identity. Yet even in that uncertainty, Scripture repeatedly tells the story of ordinary people whose paths looked unusually difficult before they became meaningful. Their journeys rarely resembled the expectations of those around them. Their seasons of waiting often became places where character was formed more deeply than success ever could have accomplished. Perhaps that is where you find yourself today. You are not simply walking a road that feels difficult, you are walking one that feels unfamiliar. Friends cannot fully understand why certain opportunities never seem to fit you. Family members may wonder why your life has not followed the pattern they expected. Sometimes even you wonder whether taking a different path has cost you too much. Yet there is something inside you that keeps refusing to settle for a life that does not align with your deepest convictions. It is not because you think you are better than anyone else. It is because every time you try to ignore what you believe God is shaping in your heart, you experience a quiet unrest that refuses to disappear. Throughout the Bible, God's work often unfolded through seasons that appeared confusing before they became clear. Waiting did not always mean abandonment. Solitude did not always mean rejection. Delay did not necessarily mean denial. Looking back, many believers have recognized that the places they once wanted to escape became the very places where their faith matured. That realization usually came long after the questions, not during them. While they were living through uncertainty, all they could see was what they lacked. Only later could they recognize what God had been cultivating within them: patience, humility, perseverance, compassion, wisdom, and a dependence upon Him that could not have been developed in easier circumstances. It is understandable if your heart grows weary. Constantly feeling different can become exhausting. Watching others celebrate milestones while you continue wondering what comes next can stir disappointment. There may even be moments when you ask God why your story seems slower than everyone else's. Those are honest questions, and the Psalms remind us that bringing honest emotions before God is not a sign of weak faith, but of genuine relationship. Faith does not eliminate every question. Instead, it gives us someone trustworthy to bring those questions to. Maybe the different path you are walking is teaching you something that comfort never could. Perhaps it is helping you notice people who feel overlooked because you know what it feels like to be unseen. Perhaps your disappointments are slowly growing compassion that will one day become a source of encouragement for someone else. Perhaps the quiet seasons are creating room for your relationship with God to deepen beyond circumstances alone. None of these possibilities erase today's pain, but they remind us that suffering does not have to be meaningless. In the Christian story, God has repeatedly demonstrated His ability to bring purpose from seasons that initially appeared empty. There is also a quiet temptation during lonely seasons to measure your value by visible progress. We compare careers, relationships, recognition, achievements, and influence. Yet Scripture consistently points our attention somewhere deeper than outward success. God is often more concerned with who we are becoming than with how quickly we arrive where we hope to go. That perspective does not make waiting easy, but it offers hope that unseen growth still matters. If this message resonates with your own experience, know that you are not alone in carrying these questions. Many faithful believers have walked through seasons where they could not understand what God was doing. Their stories remind us that uncertainty and faith can exist together. They remind us that God's presence is not measured solely by immediate answers, but also by His sustaining grace through unanswered questions. As you continue walking this different path, Resist the urge to believe that different automatically means forgotten. Some roads are quieter than others. Some seasons involve more waiting than movement. Some chapters emphasize preparation rather than visibility. Although those chapters are rarely the ones we would choose, they often become the ones that shape us most profoundly. God does not waste seasons that feel hidden. Even when you cannot yet see the destination, you can continue taking faithful steps, trusting that His wisdom extends beyond what your present circumstances allow you to understand. Your journey may not resemble the expectations you once held, but that does not mean it is without purpose. Sometimes the path that feels different becomes the place where faith grows deepest, hope becomes steadier, and character reflects Christ more clearly than before. As time passes, another struggle often begins to emerge, one that few people ever talk about. It is no longer just the loneliness or the waiting that weighs on your heart. It is the fear that your entire life is becoming one long season of preparation with no visible destination. You start wondering whether you misunderstood God's direction. You question whether the sacrifices were worth making. You remember the opportunities you declined because they did not feel right. You remember the relationships you walked away from because they pulled you further from the person you believed God was shaping you to become. Sometimes you even look at those who chose easier paths and wonder if perhaps they were right all along. That comparison can quietly steal your peace, not because you envy their possessions or accomplishments, but because you long to understand your own story. You do not want someone else's life. You simply want confidence that yours is unfolding with purpose. This is where many believers quietly struggle. They continue attending church, continue praying, continue reading Scripture, yet deep inside they carry an unspoken question. God, am I really walking where you want me, or have I simply become lost? Questions like these do not make someone faithless. In many ways, they reveal the desire to remain faithful. A heart that no longer cared would stop asking altogether. But your heart continues searching because it longs to know the one who called you. Throughout Scripture, those whom God used in remarkable ways were rarely given a complete picture of their future. They were invited to trust one step at a time. That kind of trust feels beautiful when we read about it years later, yet it feels incredibly difficult when we are the ones living it. Abraham left what was familiar without seeing the entire destination. Joseph endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment long before he could understand how those painful chapters fit into God's larger plan. David was anointed long before he wore a crown, spending years learning dependence upon God while hiding in caves instead of sitting on a throne. None of these stories suggest that suffering automatically leads to greatness, nor do they promise that every hardship will be explained in this life. Instead, they reveal something consistent about God's character. He remains faithful even when His timing remains mysterious. Perhaps you have noticed something else about your journey. The things that once satisfied you no longer hold the same appeal. Conversations centered only on status, wealth, or appearance leave you feeling strangely empty. Activities that once distracted you no longer quiet the deeper questions in your heart. At first, this change can feel isolating because it creates distance between you and people who still find fulfillment in those pursuits. Yet perhaps it also reveals that God is slowly reshaping your desires. Spiritual maturity often begins quietly. It rarely announces itself with dramatic moments every day. More often, it appears in subtle changes. You become more patient than you once were. You notice people who are hurting instead of overlooking them. You become slower to judge because your own struggles have taught you humility. You find yourself praying differently, not merely asking God to remove every difficulty, but asking Him to remain close in the middle of it. These changes may seem small, but they are significant. They reflect the quiet work of transformation that Scripture describes again and again. There are days when this inner transformation feels almost invisible. You wake up facing the same responsibilities, the same unanswered prayers, and the same uncertainties. Nothing dramatic appears to have changed, yet growth often happens beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. A tree spends years strengthening its roots before its height captures anyone's attention. Likewise, faith often deepens through countless ordinary moments that no one else notices. Every prayer offered despite disappointment every act of kindness performed without recognition, every decision to forgive instead of becoming bitter, every choice to trust God despite unanswered questions becomes part of a foundation that is stronger than immediate success could ever produce. One of the greatest dangers during a season of waiting is allowing disappointment to define your identity. If you are not careful, you begin introducing yourself to yourself through your losses. You become the person who was overlooked, the one who never fit in, the one whose plans did not work out, the one who is still waiting. While those experiences are real, they are not the entirety of who you are. Scripture consistently reminds believers that their deepest identity is found not in circumstances, but in belonging to God. That truth does not erase grief, but it prevents grief from becoming the final definition of your life. You are more than your unanswered prayers. You are more than your delayed dreams. You are more than the moments when others misunderstood you. Your worth has never depended upon how quickly your life resembles someone else's expectations. Sometimes God seems to do his deepest work when external progress appears slowest. During those seasons, he teaches lessons that cannot be rushed. Humility cannot be forced overnight. Compassion usually grows through experiencing pain ourselves. Endurance develops only by continuing when quitting seems easier. Hope becomes stronger when it survives disappointment rather than avoiding it. These qualities are precious because they shape not only what we accomplish, but also how we love, how we serve, and how we reflect Christ to others. A person whose heart has been softened by hardship often carries a gentleness that cannot be manufactured. They know how to sit beside someone else's sorrow without rushing to provide simple answers. They understand the ministry of presence because they themselves longed for someone simply to remain beside them. Perhaps this is also why your path has felt different, not because God delights in making life harder, but because he is more interested in forming Christ-like character than in providing immediate comfort. Jesus himself walked a path that many misunderstood. He experienced rejection, loneliness, betrayal, misunderstanding, and sorrow. He knew what it meant to be abandoned by friends, questioned by critics, and surrounded by people who failed to recognize who he truly was. Because of this, Christians believe they never suffer alone. Christ understands human pain not from a distance, but through experience. That truth offers comfort during seasons when no one else seems capable of understanding what you carry. Maybe there is someone watching your life right now without you realizing it. They notice that despite your disappointments, you continue showing kindness. They observe that although you have every reason to become cynical, you continue choosing hope. They see your quiet perseverance more than your visible achievements. We often underestimate how powerfully faithfulness speaks in ordinary life. A steady spirit can become a testimony long before dramatic circumstances ever change. If you have walked through a season where God seemed silent, yet you discovered his faithfulness in unexpected ways, your experience may encourage someone who is struggling today. Stories of quiet endurance remind us that we are not the first to wrestle with uncertainty, nor will we be the last. They point us toward the God whose character remains constant, even when our circumstances continually change. As this journey continues, remember that the different path is not necessarily the easier one, nor is it a guarantee of earthly success. Rather, it is an invitation to know God more deeply, to trust him more fully, and to allow his work within your heart to become more important than immediate recognition. While you may still carry unanswered questions, you do not have to carry them alone. The God who has sustained countless believers through seasons of waiting continues to meet his people with grace today. And even if you cannot yet see where every step is leading, you can continue walking with quiet confidence that his faithfulness does not depend upon your ability to understand every detail of the road ahead. There may come a day when you look back on this season and realize that what once felt like the most confusing chapter of your life quietly became the one that changed you the most. Not because every question received an answer, or because every disappointment suddenly made perfect sense, but because somewhere along the way, your relationship with God became less dependent on certainty and more rooted in trust. That transformation rarely happens all at once. It grows through ordinary mornings when you choose to pray even when your emotions feel empty. It grows through evenings when you resist the temptation to believe that silence means absence. It grows every time you decide that although you cannot control tomorrow, you can still remain faithful today. Looking back, you may discover that the greatest miracle of this season was not a dramatic change in your circumstances, but the quiet change within your own heart. The person who first entered this difficult path may not be the same person who eventually walks out of it. Many people assume that finding purpose always begins with receiving a clear vision of the future. Yet more often, purpose is discovered by faithfully living the responsibilities already placed before us. We naturally want God to illuminate the entire road ahead, but He often gives enough light for only the next step. That can feel frustrating when we crave certainty, yet it also keeps us close to Him. If every answer were already visible, we might begin trusting our plans more than His presence. Instead, Scripture continually points believers back to daily dependence. The Israelites gathered fresh provision each morning. Jesus taught His followers to pray for daily bread rather than a lifetime of guarantees. Again and again, God invites His people into a relationship built upon continual trust rather than complete control. Perhaps one reason your path has seemed so different is because you have gradually learned that true security cannot be found in circumstances alone. Careers change, relationships experience seasons of joy and seasons of difficulty. Health, finances, recognition and opportunities can all shift unexpectedly. None of those things are unimportant, but none of them were ever meant to carry the full weight of your identity. When our deepest confidence rests entirely upon temporary things, fear inevitably follows, because temporary things can be lost. Yet when our hope is anchored in God's unchanging character, we discover a steadiness that remains even when life itself feels uncertain. This does not mean Christians never experience grief or anxiety. Rather, it means grief does not have the final word because hope continues to exist alongside it. Think about the prayers you have prayed over the past several years. Some were filled with confidence, others were whispered through tears. Some consisted of many words, while others contained only silence because you no longer knew what to say. God is not surprised by any of them. The one who created your heart understands every emotion you have struggled to express. When Scripture tells us that God is near to the broken-hearted, it reminds us that His presence is not reserved for moments when we feel spiritually strong. He remains near even when our faith feels fragile. Sometimes the strongest act of faith is simply refusing to walk away when nothing seems clear. There is also something beautiful about the compassion that often grows in those who have walked difficult roads. You begin noticing the lonely person in the crowd because you remember what loneliness felt like. You become slower to judge someone's struggle because you know that appearances rarely reveal the whole story. You listen more carefully because you remember wishing someone would truly listen to you. In ways you may never fully realize, your hardships become places where God develops the ability to love others with greater patience and gentleness. While none of us would choose pain for its own sake, God is able to redeem painful experiences by shaping hearts that reflect His compassion more clearly. Do not overlook the small victories that have already taken place. Perhaps you forgive more quickly than you once did. Perhaps you recover from disappointment with greater hope than before. Perhaps your prayers have become more honest. Perhaps your desire to encourage others has grown stronger. These quiet changes rarely receive applause, yet they matter deeply. They are signs that God's work is continuing even when visible progress seems slow. Spiritual growth is often measured not by dramatic moments, but by steady transformation over time. The different path can also teach contentment without encouraging complacency. Contentment does not mean abandoning dreams or pretending that disappointment does not hurt. Instead, it means learning that your peace is not held hostage by perfect circumstances. You can continue pursuing meaningful goals while trusting that your value does not depend upon achieving them. You can grieve losses without allowing them to erase your hope. You can acknowledge unanswered questions while still believing that God's wisdom extends beyond your own understanding. This balance is difficult to learn, yet it produces a resilience that circumstances alone cannot create. As you continue forward, remember that comparison will always tempt you to believe someone else's timeline should become your own. Social media, conversations, and even well-meaning advice can subtly convince you that your life is behind schedule. But God has never measured faithfulness by comparing one believer's journey to another's. Every person carries unique gifts, responsibilities, opportunities, and challenges. The goal has never been to imitate someone else's story. The invitation has always been to faithfully live the story God has entrusted to you. That truth can bring tremendous freedom. You no longer have to chase another person's calling because you are learning to walk faithfully within your own. There may still be days when discouragement returns. You may still encounter moments when prayers seem unanswered and your direction feels uncertain. Those moments do not erase everything God has already done. Faith is not the absence of difficult days. Faith is continuing to trust God's character even when difficult days return. The same God who sustained you through yesterday's uncertainty will remain faithful tomorrow. His love is not strengthened by your successes nor weakened by your failures. His grace remains available every new morning. One day someone may ask how you found hope during a season that appeared so uncertain. You may realize that the answer is not found in having every explanation. Instead, it is found in discovering that God remained faithful, even when life did not unfold according to your expectations. You learned that His presence was not limited to mountaintop experiences, but was equally real in quiet valleys. You discovered that waiting was not empty time, but meaningful time, where patience, humility, and perseverance slowly took root. You found that your deepest confidence could rest not in knowing everything about the future, but in knowing the one who holds the future. If this message has reflected your own journey, may it remind you that you are not alone in walking a path that feels different. Across generations, countless believers have experienced seasons of uncertainty, loneliness, and waiting. They discovered, often only in hindsight, that God had been faithfully present through every step. Your story may still contain unanswered questions, and that is all right. Not every chapter reaches its conclusion immediately, yet every day offers another opportunity to trust, to love, to persevere, and to draw near to the God whose promises remain steadfast. The road may continue to look different from what you expected, but different does not mean forgotten. Different does not mean without purpose. Different does not mean beyond the reach of God's grace. As you continue walking, may your heart rest in the quiet assurance that the God who called you will also sustain you, shaping your character through every season, and reminding you that your worth has never depended on how closely your life resembles anyone else's, but on the unchanging love of the one who walks beside you every step of the way.